Today I'm going to take advantage of having Pete here to talk through a few of the issues that we've discussed this morning, and I think a chance to get a little bit more in depth, given the role of his organization, the work that he does with communities. The first thing I wanted to start our discussion about was, from a big picture perspective, was we're talking a lot about climate change and investment policies. There's a lot of growing interest and a focus on climate change and how it affects the public and private sector views. And as we noted this morning, this notion that it is now a negative to encourage investment and that it is a negative to have business activity in the north. And that is now affecting the investment policy of institutional investors. I'd like to get your perspectives a bit on your views on this and what the implications are for this type of trend in terms of investment opportunities in the north.
Sure. So just to clarify, relative to Toronto, I'm north, because I'm from Saskatoon, which is 52nd Carolina, 43. But our bank does, most of our business north of 50, which is all of the northern parts of the provinces in Canada and all of the 3 territories. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm speaking as a northerner, because there's northerners here who do a very good job of that for themselves. But I think the one unhealthy part of the north being considered in that fashion, whereby it's our deep freeze and it needs to save the world's climate, and we need to stop development up there because it's going to accelerate the changing climate and it's going to hurt the pristine north. I think that the real problem with that is that people forget there's people who live up there and who are currently living in the reality of a lack of infrastructure, a lack of employment, a lack of decent education compared to other Canadians, a lack of decent healthcare compared to other Canadians. And there has really become sort of, I think, two private perspectives on the north. One is everybody who's self-employed considers the north a nice place to visit, like once every 10 years. Maybe if they visit it at all. It's the place that's going to protect the climate. They shouldn't try and change it. And they think that the north is going to protect them from slightly warmer summers or unsettled weather and tornadoes in southern Saskatchewan. Whereas the people in the north, I think, are the ones who are, frankly, they've got a double whammy of that kind of an attitude. First of all, they are more affected by climate change than any southerners. When you go to the north and you talk to communities where people say there's never been open water here at this time of year, they don't mean like in the last 20 or 30 years, as long as their oral history goes back, which is thousands of years. So never is a long time for them, and they're really facing drastic changes. And somebody talked earlier about even the impact of infrastructure. The heating of the permafrost, and what are some older construction in those communities is significant. And at the same time, if you say to them, well, the world is changing because of what the site did to the climate, and now you're going to be impacted big time. We also want you, by the way, to stop doing any development of your resources, and we're not going to invest in you because we want you to stay as the deep freezing museum for Canada. That I think is a real concern, and it's something that Canadians have to have a serious discussion about.
So continuing on that aspect of the communities and the people that actually live there. I was just having a recent discussion. We're talking about social license. And I think that's very important for when companies look at their future projects. When we think about social license, we think about consultations with the local community. But now, because of this growing external interest, especially from an environmental perspective,
right,
then it becomes that pressure of an external, if you will, stakeholder, or someone who views themselves as a stakeholder, then driving expectations of what will happen. Your thoughts on that and how to manage those issues?
It has become a real issue in the north. So a lot of what I'm going to say might make me sound like I'm a climate denier or that I don't care about climate change. But like I said, northerners and the people I deal with are the most affected by climate change. So I have as much concern or more than most people, I think. But when you divorce that concern from the people who live there, you do some odd things. So we were involved with some family foundations who wanted to invest in the north, they wanted to invest in indigenous organizations, and they had 3 or 4 sort of priorities that their social investing wanted to focus on. And they were interested in us getting them some investment in indigenous investable development. And And so we were talking to them, and they wanted us to guarantee that we weren't going to be involved in any fossil fuel development. And we were like, well, that's hard to do because there's a lot of fossil fuels and a lot of the First Nations and groups that we deal with. And somebody talked earlier about the diesel that's burned in the communities. You can't go from diesel burning power generators to nothing because those people will cease to be able to live where they live. And so we said, well, that's impossible. We can't divorce all fossil fuels from this investment decision and get indigenous economic and social development. And one of the real ironies is the families, the family that really created the endowment that created this foundation earned all their wealth from oil and gas development all over the world. And so it was really convenient for people to be comfortable and looked after and have great infrastructure in Toronto and family wealth and all the kinds of benefits that brought. And now they were telling the next, the next group of Canadians who want to get ahead that they should stop doing that because what they did a long time ago has put us in this position.
So continuing on that theme, we've also talked a bit about ESG, the environmental, the social, and the governance. And some commentaries that have come up is that there's been a real emphasis on the environmental, a real emphasis on governance, but the social hasn't been really balanced out in that discussion.
Right.
Do you think that in particular is true for the Arctic North?
Absolutely, and a lot of the times when we talk about infrastructure in the North, we expect, we expect a mine to result in the building of a road, or we expect some kind of resource development to result in the deep water port being built, and we don't provide those Canadians with the kind of infrastructure that everybody within a 50 or 150 mile parameter or sort of circumference of this location just comes to assume. And so, when you don't have a deep water port, it creates the people who carry the lion's share of the burden from no infrastructure are the Northerners, because they, we talked earlier, people talked about the lack of access to internet. People don't realize the kind of, we operate banks in the North. So if you go to our community banking center in Kirklookta, and you're a customer, and you go there to do a deposit, you literally, it's a social environment, so it's great. People, First Nations people are very social minded and they like to talk to their neighbors. But it becomes a way of life for banking because the refresh rate on the screens in the banking system in our community banking center take 2 or 3 minutes. So if you ask for your balance, you put in your customer number, and you have to wait for that screen to refresh over 2 or 3 minutes because it's satellite internet, it's not land-based, it's definitely not 5G, and you cannot use banking apps in those communities, even if they're cell service, because the refresh on the banking screen takes longer than the timeout. So by the time you put in your password and hit enter, it'll time out before the first bank screen comes up. And that's a reality that people in the South don't realize, but that's the reality that people in the North live. And so they have to carry the cost of that. So if you want to, before our bank went into some of these very small communities, if you wanted to have a basic bank account where you could, if you work at Agnico and you wanted a direct deposit to your account, you had to fly to the neighboring community for $800 one-way ticket to open a bank account. And so the people locally carry the cost of the lack of infrastructure.
So continuing on that theme of who carries the cost, who should be carrying the cost. And I think we can discuss this a little bit more. We've talked a lot about the private sector, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about what the balance should be between the market and the state. Because neither is perfect, if you will. Right. And if there is a failure, say, in market dynamics in terms of that information, where's the role of the government, or where do you see the opportunities for a better balance between managing? Because one of the things that has come up in the last since last night was, what is the business case for infrastructure investment in the North? I don't think we have, obviously, a perfect answer to that, otherwise we would be discussing these questions, but this provides a platform to look into it. What is that relationship of how government can work with the private sector to manage this issue? But bearing in mind, as you said, at the end of the day as well, we need this infrastructure in these regions, in these communities, for a variety of purposes, not just for economic development, but everything contributes to economic development as well, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think the one thing that we've got to start with is just the agreement that the North is Canada, period. And I think that's something that's always missed in the discussions. Northerners should, you know, develop some business case for them to have roads and you know, healthcare and education. And it really is concerning to me because nobody in Toronto has to get a business case for their sewer or water to be put down the new street of their development in Mississauga. You know, I guess it's inferred that the tax base and the fact that we're in businesses and that there's economic wealth created in Toronto drives the social investment to put in the means of society to exist. But that somehow, that just doesn't get talked about in the North. People always say, well, we'll put a deep water port in over there where there's a mine, not over here where there's people that live. And, you know, one of our customers built a new hotel in Iqaluit recently, and they built a modular hotel, which is really cool. They built these modules in China, and they ship them over by ship, and they just stack block a hotel, which is, it goes up pretty quick. But, you know, Canadians would be appalled to understand that they had to ship these modules into the port, the bay in Iqaluit, because there's no deep water port there. You pull the ship in, you wait for the tide to go down, the ship sits on the floor of the ocean, trucks come out, pull off the one module, drive it onto shore. You got to do that when the tide's out, and then the ship raises up, and you got to wait for the tide to go back out again to get the next module off. You know, if we had to do building like that in Montreal, people would be appalled. Yet we allow that to happen in the North, and that's just, like I said, that's just the table stakes for it to be Canada. And I think there is a role for government to say, if we want the sovereignty has a cost. And the cost is you have to provide the needs of life for the people there. Now there is an element of economic return, but there's lots of resources that come out of the North. And often you don't see that the North gets credit for those resources. They seem to credit it for the head office of the company that mines the stuff in Toronto. And you see, you know, they say that's where the economic activity happens, but that economic activity happens where those resources come from. And Canadians have to realize that, and we have to put investment into the North.
Does this go back to like an earlier comment when we spoke last week, was this notion of why is it viewed as a subsidy for investment in the North,
right,
rather than as an investment? And do you think that comes down fundamentally to this, I guess, question is we don't need to make the same excuses if we're doing a similar type of investment in the South.
Right. Yeah, I live in Saskatchewan. We have more roads in Saskatchewan than any province in the entire country. And the reason is there used to be a farmer on every quarter section. So every quarter mile there was a farmer. So there's a grid road system in Saskatchewan. Every mile by mile in the prairies in southern Saskatchewan there's a road. 90% of them are still maintained roads. They're still gravelled and graded and all that kind of stuff. Farmers now aren't a quarter section, they're 6 sections, 20 sections. They're huge farmers. But we maintain with the public purse a whole system of grid roads that maintain an industry, which is farming, that pays part of its return, but there's no way that the farmers carry the cost of all those grid roads. So we don't ever argue about that, and we don't ever say that we're you know, there's all this social dollars that go into the farmers for Saskatchewan. Yet when we ship any dollars north, it always is seen as a burden on Canada. Can the taxpayers afford for people to live here? I've heard that a lot. And, you know, that's a real concern to me because you know, there's a cost to sovereignty. And if we want to say that's Canada, they should have you know, and other countries have done it. If we look at Greenland, you know, they put investment in. Some of those communities have way more infrastructure than their counterparts just across the strait in Nunavut.
If we shift the discussion a little bit, and we now look at then the role of the private sector. One thing that has struck me is I spent many years in Asia. In my last role, I was in Southeast Asia. So a lot of my focus there focused on Southeast Asia, ASEAN region, and very similar issues with respect to the development of infrastructure. So, you know, if I took away geography, if I talked about local communities, if I talked about economic development, resource exploration or exploitation, depending on what perspective you want to take a look at, the fundamental issue was the lack of infrastructure. Interestingly enough, when we had these discussions with, say, multilateral development banks, because of course they've got their perspectives, they've got slightly different mandates from, say, an institutional investor that is accountable to a shareholder, there was a comment that there was actually a lot of capital available The problem was they were not commercially viable projects. So, for example, we hear a lot about Russia, LNG, and China. And I think we should also be clear, LNG 1, this first Yamal project, to a certain extent, is probably one of the more commercially viable projects that exist. Right timing for pricing, right timing for a client, for customers, etc. Because we're always competing for that dollar.
Right.
Because that dollar has an opportunity cost. If I don't spend it here, where can I earn more money? How do we manage that dynamic for Canada's North? Because it's true, I think it is easy for a lot of investors to say, I'm not going to go there, because they weren't active there in the first place. They still have money, they still have opportunities to invest elsewhere. How do you manage that demand, if you will? And then how is that amplified for a region like the Arctic and the North?
Yeah, and it's even more of an issue in northern Canada because of the sparse population. So, because if you talk about a lot of the triple P sort of projects, you need a commercialization. So you need somebody to pay for that road. If you wanted to make a road, the Plitchell Road was talked earlier. If you wanted to make everybody who drives down the Plitchell Road pay a toll that made that economically viable, nobody would ever drive the Plitchell Road. It would just be prohibited. Because there's people who you have to use that every day. But I think we have to look at things differently. There's a lot of projects again done. I got roped into another panel later today, so you'll hear about it again. But if I repeat that there, but there's a lot of projects where Canada says we can't afford to do that. Yet they'll continue to do something that's slightly less expensive and goes forever. And the Five Nations Energy was a good example. They will keep shipping diesel to northern communities to power these communities, but then they said they couldn't afford to subsidize the transmission line and get them electrical power. And you can prove to the spreadsheets. I can prove to them if there's a return. If you think that you're going to keep shipping diesel to the north, and those costs even go up when you consider if you add a cost of carbon, and you add the disruption of the winter road system to the climate change. So now there's been communities in northern Manitoba where they have to actually fly in diesel because the winter roads crapped out too early. Excuse my language. But that's what they say when the winter roads melt, it's crapped out. If we just sort of ignore those costs of doing the same thing over and over and over again, and don't sort of bring that down, what kind of investment can we make that will make this government? It's not a commercial stream of revenue. It's a government stream of cost. And if we do things differently and invest in the north, it could probably end up being cheaper to do that. But you have to have the political will to go to Canadians and say we need to invest this many billions of dollars in that region to eliminate some long-term costs, make their way of living equivalent or at least close to other Canadians, and frankly open up that region for economic returns.
On that topic, just to kind of expand the potential for investors or external interests. The Arctic has obviously gotten quite a bit of international attention in the last few years. Yes, it's broadly premised on the environmental concerns, but there's another dimension about who is the relevant stakeholder or participant in these discussions. What are your thoughts on throwing external interests and potential external investors outside of what we're used to within, say, North America into this space?
Yeah, so I've personally sort of become very frustrated with the people who go to the north and tell them what to do, but don't really have to live there or know what the people have to. Like there's a friend of mine, former chief of First Nations Saskatchewan, Blaine Fable, coined the phrase, and I'm going to steal it. He probably stole it from somewhere else anyways, but he calls them eco-evangelists. They're sort of like the missionaries that went to the north and said, we'll help you, we'll help your, protect your life, and we'll help you with, social enterprise, all that kind of stuff, as long as you believe what we're selling, which is the religion we're bringing to you. And there's, I think the people who are the environmentalists are doing that a lot in the north now. They're going out and they're eco-evangelizing. They're saying, you should agree to be the, people of the land, like the caribou and and the muskox and don't change and don't invest and just live that way, and we won't even give you this necessary life, but we'll support you when it comes to you supporting the climate issues. But they're not there in reverse to say we'll support you also socially and environmentally and allow you to do the kinds of things you need to grow your economy. Because the people in the north, like I said, they're the most impacted by climate change. They're not just sort of throw the caution in the wind about climate, but they also have children that they want to have a livelihood. And they, even traditional livelihoods are too costly for many Northerners. You find that in the north, most of the people who still hunt are actually the people who are employed somewhere else, because most people who are on social assistance can't afford to hunt. You can't afford the machines and the guns and the things you need to do to live a traditional lifestyle. So the people who are really poor in the north, they're not even living traditional lifestyle anymore. They're living poor in poor communities without many services, which is a tragedy.
So when you talk about these eco-vandalism, how do you change that narrative? How do we manage to instill the audience that, again, we don't want others speaking on behalf of what's experience north? I mean, this is not obviously an easy question to solve, but how do we manage that? I feel like that was part of the challenge that we had. For example, we looked at the seal trade. Very well-meaning EU parliamentarians had very specific views about how that industry was going to run. Do we face a similar risk in the current dynamic environmental issues, and how do we manage that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I bought my wife some seal mitts, and she loves them. They're the warmest mitts ever. If you haven't bought some, buy some from an Inuit hunter. And she loves them, but she caught flack from some of her friends in Saskatoon for wearing fur mitts. And her response was the person who made these mitts ate the meat that was in it, and it's a sustainable resource, and it would provide a livelihood for people in the north. So you people who go to the grocery store and buy beef and you don't even know where it came from, don't lecture me about my sealskin mitts, and they're warm. So she became that kind of, I think Canadians have to become, they have to understand the north better, and they have to listen to Northerners. Too often some of these northern issues, and no disrespect to anybody who's talked about any of the, Southerners involved in the north is really important. I'm a Southerner who does business in the north. But at the end of the day, the Northerners' views and opinions have to be listened to, and we have to understand the reality of living out there. And we have to understand their goals and aspirations, not just for the climate, but for their economy, for their social, for their strength of their society, their history, their traditions, their languages, all those issues. If you don't talk to Northerners, you don't understand that. So somehow, Northerners speak a lot. If you sit down with a Northerner, they'll tell you what they think. And they'll articulate very well what they want for their families, for their regions, for their communities. Somehow, Canadians just have to figure out a way to listen to that.
I'm a little bit cognizant for time. I think we have about 5 minutes left for Q&A. Sorry, I'm kind of monopolizing the opportunity to ask lots of questions here, but I'd like to open it up to the floor as well.
Everybody's lunch
digesting.
Yeah. Keith, thanks. Wonderful presentation. You both, actually. Quick question: what do you make of, say, the Alberta First Nations Infrastructure Investment Fund?
I'm talking about that at the next panel.
You're talking about it at the next panel. All right. Well, just generally, I would say that part of the engine that we've had for success in Alaska's corporations was one, a land base that they could leverage, which is clear in some parts of this country and not clear yet in other parts of the country. And the other has been kind of the 8A program, which has allowed preferential bidding, to the point where a small Alaska village on the coast, where I love to go fishing, is running the Air Force Base in North Carolina, for example. And so they have built up a lot of out-of-region revenue, but it's meant jobs, and it's brought a lot of kind of home headquarters jobs back home. What's on the horizon here to help advance wealth growth
Yeah, I think that is exactly the thing we need to focus on as well. So, often in Canada, I think we allow Indigenous groups the opportunity to invest, but they have to joint venture with someone. You've got to bring outside capital in. And we don't talk a lot about wealth generation for Indigenous people, because that's where the real rubber hits the road, is wealth generation. Because often you'll get, governments will, protect a certain contract, and the First Nation can get this stuff. And you got 20% margins on this business, and they got to partner with somebody who takes 18.5% in order to do it, and they end up not creating wealth. They just, we sort of check the box when we do those kind of things. The kind of communities that we deal with who really are making progress are the ones who have wealth, and they're not shy about the fact that they've got wealth. So the James Bay Cree, for example, they have about $4.5 billion of assets under management. They've got wealth behind rights and focus and capacity in their people, and they're making huge projects. There's a lot of communities and regions in the north that are, have wealth now, and they're using that wealth to earn not just the business return, but the investment return. And the combination of both really build some really capacity to really make things happen.
I've been Whitehorse Decon, all of Decon, I guess, 47 years there. Saskatchewan for one summer in '73. and bank, and so does my corporation that I work for. Difficult for us to get investment money, any kind of money for any kind of projects we're doing. To give you an example. But here's a new one that's coming, and we're really challenged with, is that the federal government, CERNAC, is going to spend billions of dollars on Faro and Giant. And getting into those businesses to be the prime contractor without having to go to a joint venture or without having to get the points, right? The federal government has a point system on how to get into the business. I wonder, any ideas on, first of all, financing a startup reclamation business to go up to the Giant and Faro projects?
Yeah. But, well, financing deals in part. But no, I think it does take some focus, and I think what my experience with federal government procurement processes to help First Nations is pretty much bring me a paper that says it's 51% Indigenous owned, and you've seen those things. Like I can find 100 businesses that are 51% owned and 0% equity. Ends up in the hands of that 51% ownership. And it just becomes a process whereby a lot of non-Indigenous companies partner with an Indigenous individual, call it a 51-49% partnership, charge whatever fee you want behind that, and there's no real sustainable economic development. I think, I'm going to mention it later, that's something that we've really talked about with Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, is avoiding the storefronts. Really helping Indigenous people get real equity, where there's not only equity and return, but governance involvement, employment involvement, capacity building. And if you do that stuff, then you'll have a real sustainable outcome. If it's simply a 51-49% ownership, and you've seen that all the time, I'm sure, where they really just want something simple. So get the guy who's already doing the contract, partner with somebody, call it 51-49, and then just keep dealing with the non-Indigenous company.
That's a good example, because the Carcross Tagish Management Corporation, of course, the citizens are the shareholders, and they're also the workforce that I work for them. I'm not right. I work for them. The first decision was no joint ventures. We will hire you potentially as a master service contractor. Right. Two things you have to have. You might be a Nobel Prize winning scientist, but if you can't teach, no thanks, you're gone. And the young person in the community is going to make that decision because, well, that guy didn't teach me anything, but I'm learning. The other is to have the citizens that are the shareholders look at the work that they want to do and then focus on going and getting that work. And therefore then helping them start a business. So now, I've only been there 3 years. We've started 4 contractors, 12 some people, 8 of them off to apprenticeships. That's the way to start to change that we're trying to do. And the other one is word changes with everybody. And what capacity building? Workforce development, personal and professional growth. No capacity. It's a bit of a joke word. It doesn't mean anything. They use it all the time as reconciliation. Look at that topic later.
Before we wrap this up, is there one last chance, one last question from the audience?
I'm actually going to ask you as moderator, given your other hat. You do quite a bit of work with Canada and international trade. What is the international market looking at here? And there's an Indigenous Council at the United Nations. There's been an effort at the Arctic Council to kind of come up with an Indigenous fund as well. Do you see any international action that can kind of help the wealth of the investment capabilities that we're talking about here?
Do you mean in terms of building a domestic capital capacity, or? Yeah,
or even transnational, or just I don't know. I mean, there have been some attempts. There's obviously, people who might have discovered medicines in Indonesia have said, well, you got that from our traditional medicine plants. Has that activity ever come up in your work?
To be quite honest, so just kind of put the kind of parameters in terms of where I've seen this. So I worked as a trade commissioner for about 10 years in Asia. And there, our mandate was promotion of Canadian products and services and attraction of investment. And to be quite honest, we talk not that often about the North. We did, though, my one caveat on that is we talked about the North, and I should also note the timing that I was there. So I was there from 2005 to, so I was in Asia from 2005 until 2017. And then specifically in Greater China up until 2012. So that period where I say is significant is because if you also look at commodity prices, that's the other thing. Sometimes there's one thing I've learned is it doesn't matter how great your model is, how great your analysis is, timing is actually pretty important. And so with the financial crisis in 2008, and then kind of the way that the direction of commodity prices and the way that China traded steel, the attitudes towards rare earth. So and then at that time as well, there was a lot of capital in Asia, unlike in North America at that time. And also how they looked at capital was different. It was interesting, yesterday the comment about, infrastructure is a new form of a bond yield, right? And when we were talking about potential investment opportunities with Asian investors, I felt like the way that they wanted to treat it was like, if I can get a guaranteed yield of 4 or 5%, totally comfy to work with. That's why I like the idea of a P3 concept. So you saw a lot of Asian investors, for example, Australia, and you see them also into like the UK, right? Because they like partnering with government because they think then there is a good, the risk is mitigated, they're getting a certain amount of yield on it, and they're comfortable with that money. The other interesting thing that came out of that was, depending on the investor that you spoke to, some that were extremely wealthy, they wanted big projects. They didn't want the $1 million or the $2 million gain. They wanted the 100, the 200 million, because that's where they really had a competitive advantage because they provide that much capital. So that was really more on the resource side of things, and I think that was kind of a function of timing and a function of interest in that. When I think about diversification of the northern economy, I think that's another thing that comes up, because we talk about the people too, right? The mines are the mines, and the resources, but what about the other associated industries that belong to the region? And I have to say, I think in that space, there's a lot to be done in terms of building capacity. Because when we were out at market, our approach was we wanted companies that were ready, that were market ready, right? Because if you scout a customer, that's great, but then when you come back and you don't have capacity, that has an impact in terms of our own reputation. So I can't really answer that in terms of that type of initiative. Like, it was very resource focused, and then when we talked about kind of companies itself, there was this real concern about capacity. Was their ability to deliver to these markets? They might be interested in that product. If you don't have that capacity, how can they pursue it? My only comment to that is, now I live in Norway, which I find interesting because it's such a tiny country, relatively speaking, very small population. Yet they have developed some of the most innovative offshore industries. I think of the companies that I knew in China that had built, some type of specialized whatever for one technology company they bought by Rolls-Royce. But these guys were entrepreneurs, so that was great. They went to join the company for a little bit, but then this is kind of boring. I want to make my own product. I want to make my own company and build something else. So I don't buy the small population side of things, but how do you actually harness and take advantage of the people that are there, the knowledge that are, how do you bring that up? So I find it challenging in that there, I don't think that, and the other thing is I find, this is more anecdotal comment, because I've not been working on the North for very long, it's only been a few years. What I find very interesting is we tend to talk about the Arctic and the North as a homogeneous region. The Nordics, to me, you know, at least Norway, does not Canada's North. And so from a global level, when you look at the circumpolar community, there's a lot of differences. Even if you look at Russia, a small community there is what, 50,000 people in their Siberian Far East. And then when we look at Canada's North, and we're talking about, you know, right now we're just speaking of the territories. Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, they're also very different economies. Even just the way that you guys are, the way that the population and demographics are dispersed, right? Yukon is heavily concentrated around Whitehorse. Nunavut is maybe 30–40%, if I'm not mistaken, around Iqaluit, and then the rest of the population is spread out through the territory. So I think that's another thing we're talking about. Looking at that. I think we tend to talk about the Arctic and the North as one entity, and then we'll go back to talking about business cases or whatever. How do you manage that risk? How do you quantify that? How do you address that? If that's a lump that everyone's in, then you can't actually, I think, give an adequate, I think, kind of more targeted look at those issues. So I managed to answer that, I think, without giving you an answer. But kind of the issues that I
just
saw.
looking for more money for him.
But so, and is that though, could that be seen as a good thing? So if, let's say you're trying to, a multi-layered package, right? But like, in terms of just, if you were like investing in Canada, you're trying to sell, you know, parts of Canada to why, you know, other countries should be investing there. Could that diversity of those, you know, those regions themselves actually create then more reason, a diversification of reasons for investment? If it could be put together and packaged well in terms of like, you know, it's not just, you know, this one resource base, or it's not just this, you know, the way this works, you know, the one asset that, you know, or commodity that this territory, you know, the whole region has, but it's actually a number of things. So you've got some innovative capacity, you've got some you know, resources here, you've got this, and I mean, could that be actually better in terms of?
But when you talk to the investor, they're in one industry, right? So if you're talking to an investor that's in, say, the tech industry, then you wouldn't really talk about a complementary industry, because that's not really necessary, unless you're talking to a larger conglomerate, then maybe you could talk to various business units. I think one thing that's different, like from when I was around, is now we have Invest in Canada, because before, you know, we're not supposed to say go to this province versus the other province. We want people to choose Canada first and then make those decisions. So I think at least we're in the right direction in terms of having a more united front, and then maybe be able to address like these are the overall strengths of investment into our country, and these are the different areas that you can go to depending on your industry, depending on what your parameters are. But basically, just kind of distract them on the institution funds. I know you guys are talking about sovereign wealth funds and how to get them to invest in the communities. I think you also have to really look at the investment, what the mandate of the funds are, if I'm not mistaken. So, for example, Norwegian sovereign wealth funds is very clearly, they don't want to invest in fossil fuels, and that's because it's a hedge against the fact that the majority of the revenues come from that industry, right? So, those are not necessarily apples to apples comparisons. We kind of have to look at what the mandate of those funds are, and if we're going back to our, maybe that's the question that we need to pose ourselves. Do we need to create a fund that has that type of mandate to pursue those growth opportunities? Yep.
Just a thank you to Keith, for you to take back to your staff. Fabulous job you guys do, and certainly getting these young people that we're working with, debit card and a bank account so that payroll can be deposited into their account. We don't have to cut checks. We have to run to town on Friday to deposit in the bank and get all the cash out and then bring all the cash back and it's gone by Monday. So keep it up and take that to your staff. It's fabulous work.
Yeah, they do all the work, so I'll take from that back.
Well, we're telling them.
Thanks very much. Same from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.